My daughter called me worthless, then demanded my help. When I turned away, she named me heartless, but I knew that for the first time, I was living with my own heart in mind. Let me tell you how everything unfolded. First, I want to quickly thank you for your continuous support. This means a lot to us. If you enjoy the stories we share, kindly subscribe to this channel. It will be great if you can leave a comment on which city you are watching from. We might just give you a shout out in our next story. Today's special shout out goes to Richard Wright from Alaska. We are glad you enjoy our stories. Now let's go deeper into the story. My daughter stood in the doorway of my small kitchen, her eyes cold and bright in the dull morning light, and she called me worthless. Her voice didn't rise or crack. It was steady, practiced, like she'd said it to herself 100 times before ever daring to say it to me. It landed harder than any shout would have, a final verdict that reached back through every argument we'd ever had. I didn't answer right away because the truth was, I didn't know how. For years, I'd let her words shape who I thought I was, her anger a kind of map I followed without question. But standing there in that worn-out kitchen, the cracked mug warm in my hand, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't let myself feel in years. The quiet certainty that I didn't have to be her punching bag anymore. She didn't wait for me to respond. She walked into the room like she owned it, her shoulders stiff and her hands clenched at her sides. I watched her scan the clutter on the counter, the chipped plates in the sink, things she used to blame me for, as if a broken dish could explain all the cracks in her life. She turned to me, her mouth twisted in that familiar mix of disdain and need. "I need your help," she said, her voice as sharp as the winter air outside. "You're my father. You're supposed to help me." The accusation in her tone was as clear as the demand. I took a slow breath, my fingers wrapped around the chipped handle of the mug, and I let her words wash over me without pulling me under. I'd heard it all before. Every time she'd fallen, every time she'd needed a rescue, she'd used that same voice. And every time, I'd given in. I told myself that was what it meant to be a good father, to keep picking her up, no matter how many times she fell. But now, I could feel how much of myself I'd lost in that bargain. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice low but steady. "I can't help you this time." The silence that followed was colder than any winter morning. She stared at me like she didn't recognize me, like the man in front of her wasn't the father who'd always said yes. "You're heartless," she said finally, her voice trembling with the effort to keep from screaming. And maybe she believed it, but I knew it wasn't true. I wasn't heartless. I was finally listening to my own heart, and it was telling me to stop. She grabbed her coat from the chair, the motion sharp and final. She didn't look back as she walked out, the door slamming behind her and a punctuation I felt in my bones. I didn't chase her. I didn't call out. I just stood there in the quiet she left behind, the cracked mug still warm in my hands. The silence was heavy, but it was mine. And for the first time, I didn't feel like filling it with excuses. I looked down at the mug, the hairline crack running through the ceramic like a scar. I'd kept it even when the handle broke, a small act of stubbornness that felt like a truth I hadn't dared to speak out loud. That even things that were cracked could still hold warmth. That maybe I was allowed to be like that too. I didn't know what would come next. I didn't know if she'd come back, full of rage or remorse. But I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let her decide who I was anymore. I wasn't going to keep giving her pieces of me until there was nothing left. I was done. And in that quiet kitchen, with the mug warm against my palms, that felt like the first real victory I'd ever claimed for myself. The first few days after she left were the hardest. The apartment felt too quiet, every room heavy with the echo of her absence. I moved through the space like I was trespassing in my own life, the air still thick with the sharpness of her last words. I caught myself listening for her footsteps in the hallway, the soft scrape of her keys in the lock, habits I didn't even realize I'd built around her. But the only sound was the low hum of the fridge, the soft creak of the floorboards under my feet. It was a quiet I didn't know how to fill at first, but it was honest, and that felt like something worth holding on to. I spent the mornings cleaning the kitchen, wiping down counters I'd stopped caring about years ago. Each swipe of the rag felt like I was scrubbing away the residue of her demands. Each dish I put away like I was making space for myself to breathe. The cracked mug stayed on the counter, a small testament to the fact that even things that had been broken could still be useful. I found a strange comfort in that. In the quiet of those early hours, I let myself imagine a life that didn't revolve around her needs, didn't revolve around anyone's needs but my own. It was a small dream, but it was mine. At night, the weight of the silence was heavier. I lay in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, and wondered if I was doing the right thing. The guilt was a steady drumbeat in the dark, telling me I was failing her the way I'd always feared I would. But another voice, quieter but truer, told me that loving someone shouldn't mean destroying yourself for them. That maybe the real failure was in letting her anger define me. I held on to that voice, even when the guilt tried to drown it out. Friends called to check in, their voices soft with concern. My sister's words were careful, like she didn't want to poke at something that might shatter. "Are you sure you're okay?" she asked me one night, her voice crackling through the phone. I told her the truth. I wasn't sure. But I knew I was done living on my knees. I knew I was done being the man who never said no. In the quiet, I started to find myself again. I made simple meals, read books I'd forgotten I owned. I took long walks in the evening air, letting the cold wind clear the clutter from my mind. The city felt different without her demands pressing against my ribs, like a place I could belong to instead of a place I was always trying to escape. Each day felt like a small step back to something I'd almost forgotten I could be. A man who could stand in his own life without apology. The cracked mug stayed on the counter, a small act of defiance and remembrance. I traced the fracture with my thumb some nights, reminding myself that broken didn't mean useless. That maybe it meant I was finally seeing the truth of things. And in that quiet, I started to believe that being alone wasn't the same as being lonely. That the man I was becoming might be someone worth knowing, someone worth trusting. It was in the small hours of the morning, when the world was hushed and the streetlights cast soft pools of light through my window, that I started to see the shape of who I could be without her. There was no epiphany, no grand revelation, just the slow, deliberate act of living in a way that didn't revolve around her anymore. I began to clean out the spare room, the one she'd always treated like her personal refuge. I sorted through the stacks of boxes and old clothes, each item a relic of the life I'd built around her chaos. Every shirt I folded, every drawer I emptied felt like I was reclaiming an inch of ground I hadn't realized I'd surrendered. I found an old photo of us, her hand in mine, both of us younger, smiling in a way that felt honest and unguarded. I sat there on the dusty floor, staring at that picture, and I let myself feel the ache of what we'd lost. I thought about the boy I'd been back then, the one who believed that love meant sacrifice, that a father's worth was measured by how much he could carry. I thought about the man I was now, and I realized I didn't have to keep paying for her mistakes with my own peace. In the quiet of that room, I let myself feel anger, real and sharp. Anger at her for using me like a safety net she never wanted to respect. Anger at myself for letting it happen for so long. It felt like a fire in my chest, burning away the years of guilt and shame I'd worn like a second skin. But beneath that anger, there was something else, a kind of clarity I hadn't known I was capable of. The understanding that I could love her and still walk away. That I could be her father and still choose myself. I started fixing things around the apartment. Small repairs I put off for years. I tightened the loose hinges on the kitchen cabinets, patched the cracks in the drywall, even gave the walls a fresh coat of paint. It wasn't about the apartment. Really, it was about proving to myself that I could still build something steady, something that didn't rely on her presence or her approval. The act of making things whole, even in small ways, felt like a promise I was keeping to the man I was becoming. Some nights, I still woke to the echo of her voice, sharp, accusing, calling me heartless. But in those dark hours, I'd turn on the small lamp by my bed, its warm glow steady against the shadows, and remind myself that silence didn't mean I was lost, that I was learning to stand in the quiet, to let it settle around me without letting it define me. The cracked mug sat on my nightstand, a reminder that even things that had been broken could still be enough. Friends asked if I was okay, and I told them the truth in pieces, enough for them to know I wasn't drowning, but not so much that I had to relive every wound. Some of them didn't understand. Some of them told me to give her another chance, to be the bigger man, to remember she was my daughter. But I'd spent a lifetime being the bigger man, the one who swallowed every sharp word and kept giving even when there was nothing left. I was done being that man. I was ready to be the man who knew where he ended and she began. I started spending my evenings by the window, the city's lights flickering in the distance. I let myself dream small dreams, of mornings that started with my own quiet rituals, of days that didn't begin and end with someone else's need. I thought about the kind of man I wanted to be, the kind of life I wanted to build. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy, but it was mine. And for the first time in years, that felt like something worth holding on to. She came back on a Sunday afternoon, the late light slanting through the window in pale stripes. I heard the knock on the door and knew it was her before I even moved to answer. My chest tightened, but I didn't let it show. I'd been expecting this in the way you expect the tide to come back in, inevitable, but something I didn't have to let wash me away. When I opened the door, she was standing there with her arms crossed, her eyes hard and wary. She didn't look like the girl I'd raised, the one who used to climb into my lap after nightmares and tell me she felt safe in my arms. She looked like someone who'd decided the world owed her something, and she wasn't going to leave until she got it. "I just need a place to stay," she said, her voice tight with the effort to sound casual. "Just for a little while, Dad. That's all." I stepped aside to let her in, not because I was folding, but because I wanted her to see what she was really asking for. She walked into the kitchen, her eyes flicking over the small changes I'd made, the fresh paint, the cleared counters, the way the place seemed to breathe without her constant presence. She looked at the cracked mug on the shelf, its fracture still visible, and I saw her mouth tighten just a little. She didn't say anything about it, but I knew she saw it. She saw that I'd kept it, that I hadn't thrown it away just because it wasn't perfect anymore. She sat at the table, her fingers drumming against the wood like she was testing its strength. "I know I said some things," she started, her voice measured and careful, "but you're my dad. You're supposed to help me." She didn't apologize, didn't soften her gaze. She didn't see the years I'd spent emptying myself for her. She only saw what she thought she was owed. I stood across from her, the weight of the cracked mug in my hands grounding me in a way I hadn't expected. "I'm not saying no because I don't care," I said, my voice calm, even. "I'm saying no because I have to. I can't keep letting you come back just because you know I'll always open the door." The words tasted strange in my mouth, firm, final, but they felt like the truth. And I was done running from that. She didn't move, didn't blink. "You're heartless," she said, her voice low and cold. "I knew you'd turn your back on me eventually. You're just like everyone else." There was something almost rehearsed in her words, a script she'd memorized so well she didn't even hear herself anymore. I let her say it, let the bitterness wash over me without taking root. I'd stopped being the man who let her anger define my worth. She stood then, her chair scraping against the floor, the sound of it sharp in the quiet. She grabbed her bag, her shoulders stiff. "You'll regret this," she said, her voice shaking just enough to let me know she meant it. But I didn't flinch. I'd spent too many years drowning in her storms. I wasn't going to let her pull me under again. When the door closed behind her, I stood in the kitchen, the cracked mug warm in my hands. The silence was deep, but it didn't feel empty. It felt like the kind of quiet you find in the middle of a forest, alive and waiting. I took a breath, let it fill me up. I knew this might be the last time I saw her, that she might never come back with anything but blame. But I also knew that I'd done the right thing for both of us. I'd shown her that love didn't mean sacrifice without end, that a father's love could be both steady and firm. I set the mug down on the counter, the crack still there, still visible. It didn't make it any less mine. It didn't make it any less able to hold warmth. And in that quiet kitchen, I realized the same was true for me. The days after she left again were different from the first time. There was no hollow ache in the pit of my stomach, no panicked rush to fill the silence she'd left behind. This time, there was a kind of steady calm that took up residence in the spaces she used to occupy. I moved through the apartment like it was a place I'd finally allowed myself to live in, not just a temporary stop on the way to her next crisis. The cracked mug sat on the shelf in the kitchen, a quiet reminder that even the things that break can be part of something whole. I spent my days fixing what I could fix and letting go of what I couldn't. I painted the hallway, patched the holes she'd left in the walls. I opened the windows in the mornings and let the cold air fill the rooms, clearing out the stale breath of old arguments and half-finished apologies. At night, I sat by the window with the city lights flickering in the distance, a book in my lap, and the warmth of my own quiet for company. I didn't miss the noise of her demands. I didn't miss the way I used to bend myself into shapes I didn't recognize just to keep her anger at bay. Then one night, she came back. It was late, the world outside wrapped in darkness and rain. She knocked once, soft and sharp, and I opened the door to find her standing there, her hair wet, her shoulders squared. She didn't look like she was here to plead. She looked like she was here to fight. "I just need you to listen," she said, her voice taut, like she was holding herself together with nothing but willpower. She stepped inside without waiting for me to answer, her eyes sweeping the apartment like she was measuring how much of it she still had a claim to. She stood in the kitchen, her arms crossed, and I could see the familiar flicker of defiance in her eyes. "You think you're so much better than me," she said, her voice low and cutting. "But you're just a coward, hiding behind your quiet." I set the cracked mug down on the counter, my hands steady even as my heart pounded in my chest. "I'm not hiding," I said, my voice soft but firm. "I'm choosing. There's a difference." The words tasted like steel on my tongue, but they were the truest thing I'd ever said. She laughed, sharp and humorless, the sound of it bouncing off the walls. "You're supposed to be my father," she said, her voice cracking at the edges. "You're supposed to take care of me, no matter what." The words were a challenge, a demand. But they weren't a truth I recognized anymore. I took a breath, let it fill the space between us. "I am your father," I said, my voice steady. "But I'm also a man who's done being broken by someone else's choices. I can't keep carrying this for you." I saw the moment the words landed, saw the way her shoulders stiffened like she'd been slapped. But I didn't apologize. I didn't take them back. Her face hardened, her eyes cold and bright. "So that's it," she said. "You're just going to throw me away?" There was a tremor in her voice, the barest hint of the girl she used to be, but I didn't let it pull me under. I'd spent enough years trying to save her from herself. "I'm not throwing you away," I said, my voice low even. "I'm setting you free. And I'm setting myself free, too." The truth of it filled the room like a prayer I hadn't known I'd been waiting to say. She didn't answer. She turned away, grabbing her bag from the chair where she'd dropped it. She moved like she was trying to hold herself together, every step careful and deliberate. At the door, she paused, her hand on the knob. "You'll regret this," she said, her voice flat and final. But I didn't let her words take root. I'd spent too long letting her anger decide who I was. When the door closed behind her, I stood there in the quiet, the cracked mug on the counter a silent witness to the man I was choosing to be. My heart ached, but it was the clean ache of healing, not the hollow ache of loss. I knew she might never come back, and I knew that was a price I was willing to pay. Because this wasn't about winning or losing. This was about reclaiming the pieces of myself I'd given away one apology at a time. The apartment felt bigger somehow, the quiet deeper but not as heavy. I turned off the lights, the darkness wrapping around me like a comfort instead of a threat. I lay down in bed, the cracked mug resting on the nightstand, and let the stillness settle into my bones. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. I didn't know if the echo of her anger would ever really fade. But I knew that I wouldn't let it define me anymore. And that was enough. In the weeks after she left for good, the apartment grew into something that finally felt like home. There were no echoes of her footsteps in the hall, no sharp notes of accusation waiting in the corners. Just the soft sigh of the wind through the cracked window and the low hum of the city outside, sounds that felt like my own breath, steady and unbroken. I let myself settle into the quiet, let it wrap around me like a promise. I'd spent so many years making room for her storms that I'd forgotten what it felt like to live in a place that was mine alone. I filled the spaces she'd left with small acts of care. I bought new curtains, soft and clean, the color of early morning light. I rearranged the furniture, each piece a decision I made for no one but myself. I found comfort in the rituals of the day, coffee in the cracked mug, the warm weight of it in my hands, the slow unfolding of hours that belonged to me. There was no rush, no need to keep up with someone else's demands. Just the steady rhythm of my own choosing. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I still heard her voice, sharp and brittle, calling me heartless. But it didn't have the power it once did. It was just an echo, a memory of the man I used to be. The man who thought love meant saying yes even when it cost me everything. The man who thought a father's worth was measured by how much he could break himself to keep someone else whole. I held those memories gently, like old wounds that had finally stopped bleeding. One morning, as the sun slipped over the city in soft streaks of gold, I stood in the kitchen and looked at the cracked mug on the shelf. I thought about how I'd almost thrown it away once, how I'd kept it because it felt like a piece of me damaged, but still able to hold warmth. I ran my thumb over the line of the crack, the glue that held it together shining faintly in the light. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and I realized that was enough. I started writing again, not for anyone else, but for myself. Words that felt like confessions, like the quiet truths I'd never let myself say out loud. I wrote about the years I'd spent lost in the shadows of other people's expectations, about the small, fierce ways I'd started to find myself again. I wrote about the cracked mug, how it had become a symbol of the man I was learning to be. Not unbroken, but unafraid of the cracks. One day, a letter arrived in the mail, no return address, just my name in her sharp handwriting. I held it in my hands, the paper thin and trembling like her voice had been that last night. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I lit a candle and watched the flame flicker in the quiet. The letter burned clean and fast, the smoke rising like a final prayer. I let it go, the last thing she could use to pull me back into her orbit. Because I'd learned that closure wasn't something she could give me. It wasn't something I could find in her apologies or her anger. It was something I had to carve out for myself, in the quiet of my own breath, in the soft defiance of my own choosing. I didn't know if she'd ever come back, or if her absence would be the last chapter in our story. But I knew that I wouldn't let her silence define me. I wouldn't let her absence be the measure of my worth. Now, in the stillness of my own life, I found a kind of peace I never knew was possible. It's not perfect. There are nights when the old doubts creep in, when I wonder if I could have done more, been more. But then I remember the cracked mug on the shelf, and I know I am enough, even in my imperfections. I am enough because I am here, because I am still standing. And if you're still listening, if you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and protecting your own heart, then you know. Sometimes doing the right thing doesn't look brave. It just looks quiet. But that kind of quiet? That's power. If this story felt like your own, if you saw yourself somewhere in the middle of it, I'd love for you to stay. Hit that subscribe button. Join the quiet ones who never stop fighting for what matters. See you soon in our next story.